You declined. I can't believe that.
Because it stinks.
One of the things we're always looking for is data owners, and there are clearly some very big multinational companies out there sitting on some very big data sets.
I call it the long tail of shit.
Everything I do has to be, 5.9 stars, has to be on a hero.
I'm going to take the microphone away.
Welcome to That's What I Call Marketing, the podcast where you'll hear from the leading lights in the marketing world and listen to their unique insights. I am going to talk to you about a topic that is really important for all marketers. Yes, we are going to talk about the cost of dull. Now, you have probably seen the work from Karen Nelson-Field and Adam Morgan, Cost of Dull Creative, Cost of Dull Media, and we are going to delve deep into that topic today. And yes, I am joined once again, third time being joined by Karen Nelson-Field, and that's what I call marketing. She's CEO of Amplified Intelligence and a pioneer, as you well know, in attention metrics. And she teamed up with Adam after he and Peter Field worked on the cost of dull creative to explore the cost of dull media. Now, Adam Morgan, who you know is the founder of Eat Big Fish and author of Eating the Big Fish. He's a leading expert in challenger brand strategy and creative audacity. Really wonderful combination to get Adam and Karen working together, talking about the cost of dull media, cost of dull creative, the combined cost of the dullness of both. And we get into how do you figure out where things sit in terms of the dullness and really get into some practical things that marketers can do. And that's really important. When we talked about recording this episode, we wanted to go beyond maybe what you've read or heard before and really figure out what are the things that you can do. Some really practical insights and help and advice for marketers, which is what we need. We also talk about the future of where the cost of dull is going. And we end off with just a wonderful piece about risk and responsibility, which is really, really insightful. And if you check out the show notes after you listen to that piece, I'll share the video that we reference, and it really is well worth watching. So let's get right into it with the wonderful Karen Nelson-Field and Adam Morgan. Karen and Adam, great to see you both. We all got to see each other in person. I was front row at your talk in Cannes with both Mark and V from the Sleeping Barber podcast. So great to catch up and chat to you about everything that is incredibly dull, except for this episode, obviously.
Which is scintillatingly interesting.
Yeah, exactly. Let's start at the start. When we talk about dull, can we define dull? Because my dull and your dull might be different, but the data tells us that there's a lot of dull out there. Maybe, Adam, we start with you and talking about the dull creative, because you had a brilliant piece where you kind of tested, or what could have been an ad, and it kind of showed how bad everything else is.
Yes. I suppose start with what Hollywood would call the inciting incident. When they make the movie of Karen and I and Peter and John doing this, it'll start with me watching television with my mum on a Saturday night in Welsh, on the Welsh borders, and the centre break comes on Saturday night. The most expensive centre, because my mum still watches terrestrial television and I watch it with her. A most expensive break, obviously, that you can get in terms of advertising, and me just looking at it and thinking, it's all shit. I can't believe it. It's all shit. And a deep sense of shame that my mum is sitting there and she's thinking, so this is what you've been doing for the last 40 years. And I thought, oh my God, what does she think of what I've done with my life? And so it really started with that very strong emotional feeling. And I've known Peter Field for a long time. We started more or less the same week together in our first agency and have been friends ever since. And I was the worst account manager in the history of account management, and he was already the smartest planner in the room. And sort of, he kind of dragged me along for 2.5 years until I moved into strategy. But I said to Peter, look, this is what shocks me, what appalls me is we know what we're supposed to be doing here. It's not like it's a secret. You and Les published 20 years ago? We know what we're supposed to be doing. Every client you speak to quotes Binet and Field. So we all know. Why is there this extraordinary gap between knowing what we're supposed to be doing and actually the vast amount of mediocrity and dross that's out there? So the two first data sets that we had, the IPA very kindly allowed Peter to crunch his stuff, and he looked at the basic kind of founding principle essentially was that let's take Kahneman's principle of kind of loss aversion, which is the pain of losing something, is twice as powerful as the pleasure of gaining it. And so maybe we've got this all wrong, Peter. Instead of showing the upside of creativity, which you and us have been doing, let's do the other thing. Let's show the downside of being dull, which is the work that we've been doing now. And let's put a concrete cost on it. Could you do that with your data? And so Peter's first work looked very specifically at that using the IPA data, right? And so in Peter's case, I would define dull effectively as something interesting as the ability to engage and hold attention, and dull is the opposite of that, which is the inability to engage and hold attention. But in Peter's case, when he's doing that first set of data, dull, he used rational kind of communication as a proxy for that. So stuff that uses facts to try and persuade me that this is better in some kind of way. And the rational stuff versus the more emotional fame generating stuff was effectively cost you 10 million quid more to achieve the same commercial impact. And this is quite an important point, actually, because in cost of dull content, and this is different from what Karen is saying, cost of dull content, we're not saying that dull doesn't work. We're saying that dull can work, but it's very expensive.
Right.
When you come to look at dull media, it's a different story, actually. And that's quite an important distinction that perhaps Karen will come and tease out later on. So that was the first thing we looked at. And then, of course, we got into the System 1 database with John Evans and the System 1 team. And they looked at the bigger study because they've pre-tested everything that's gone out in terms of TV ads, just TV ads, in the US and the UK since 2017. And essentially looked at, and the proxy for dull there is, feel nothing at all, effectively. Yeah. What proportion of people feel nothing at all having seen an ad? And it was roughly 50% of people felt nothing at all after seeing the advertising. So we then did this interesting experiment because I was keen that actually we create some conversation around this. John and I came up with this idea that we would put some film through their database and see how it performed. So I said, let's take a shot of a cow chewing grass for 20 seconds. And I should just say, this shot of the cow chewing grass, this is not Ridley Scott, A Golden Hour in Tuscany, right? This is a rather dull Welsh hillside with a bit of wire in front of the cow, and on a drab day, and you can see the town in the background. It's about as unbucolic as it's possible to be. And still this piece of film, in terms of emotional engagement, in terms of attention, in terms of interest, beat 50% of their database. And I think the really striking thing about this is it's not like marketing and communications is full of stupid people. It's not. We're all really smart people, right? We're all really smart people. It's not like we're not well-intentioned. We don't wake up, wanting to do the best for our business. Of course we do. Everybody wants to do that. It's not like we don't work our socks off. Everybody's checking emails at 11 o'clock at night. So how is it that so many smart, well-intentioned people who are working so hard and know what we're supposed to be doing are still producing ads that 50% of the time can't beat a cow chewing grass in an ugly Welsh hillside? How can that be? How can that be?
And we will, because I want to get to some of that, like, how does that happen? Because I think that's actually a really important part of the conversation we can have today, is not just how it can happen, but like what we can do to try prevent it. Because some of the how it'll happen, we may not be able to prevent, but we can get into. But interestingly, I was doing some work with an organization called the National Dairy Council in Ireland at the time that this came out. They're going, just put them together, and everybody else out there, they didn't. For my influence. And Karen, Adam mentioned attention there. That's largely a huge part of your work around attention. What made you kind of come in and say, I think there's another angle to this?
Oh, well, a couple of reasons. Firstly, the goal of this year's project was to keep the methodology as similar as possible. So the short answer is, Adam kind of mentioned they picked a proxy for success for creative, and we did the same thing. But ultimately, we were in the same boat. We had, I think it was like 190 campaigns and, hundreds of thousands of views and multiple countries. We had CPM, we had a return on investment, both long and short. So we kind of had our own little IPA database equivalent, which had some proven results. But the proxy that we chose was attention volume, which is basically attentive reach times by time. So how many people are watching for how long. So it's a volume measure out of 100. And that is the closest or the strongest predictability we've ever seen with attention per se to outcomes. So we'll split the data into quartiles, just like they did with theirs, and then look at best worst, essentially. So that's kind of how we did it. Why I did it is because the creative piece tells part of the story. And, even Orlando and I've been on stage before talking about the reality of even good creative is constrained by the ability of the media to afford the attention, if that makes sense. So some media are just not designed to give you the stage required for a non-dull creative. So I was really interested in doing it and I loved the idea of the tariff, because I feel like that brings it back to something from abstract to real for marketers. And that's kind of how it evolved. And Adam kind of approached me along with Pete, and here we are. And I absolutely love the work. I talk about it all the time.
It is amazing. And we will really quickly touch on how you brought it to life in Cannes. I was lucky to be there. And as we walked into the room, we were handed these, people are watching this beautiful card, Ennui, and it was sprayed. And Karen is wearing the Ennui t-shirt. Am I even saying it correctly?
Yeah.
It was sprayed with this fragrance. Adam, do you want to just talk about that? Because it was just so clever. We actually even stopped you on the street.
That's right.
At Colin Lewis, and I was like, "Oh, Adam, can you show them the spray?"
I think I actually offered you a refresh spray, and you declined. I can't believe that.
Because it stinks.
Possibly. Yeah. So, I mean, one of the really exciting things about it, I think, is that people are starting to replicate the costs of dull content study in other geographies. Canada, South Africa, Australia are starting to do it, and even in France. So I was contacted by a president of a French agency who's also the head of the kind of the effectiveness of the 4A's group, or the IPA effectively, said that we want to replicate the cost of dull study in France. And I said, oh, great. I said, by the way, what is it in French? What is the cost of dull in French? And he said, it's le coup d'ennui. And I said, that's amazing, isn't it? Even ennui sounds sexier, and even dullness sounds sexy in French somehow. But I also like, ennui sounded like one of those big kind of over-the-top fragrance launches from the 80s, like Egoist and all those kinds of things. So I thought, oh, that's not interesting. What if we could launch at Cannes, because this is a festival of ideas as much as other things, we could launch an idea, and the idea would be a fragrance that had the smell of burning money. So I briefed one of my team, Helen, to create a fragrance with the smell of burning money by Cannes. And so she mixed up all sorts of things in some sort of awful brew. And that's where we got to. And actually, it was, I mean, the previous year we'd done the cows, and I wanted an idea that captured attention and got people talking at some kind of degree. And there Karen is still wearing the t-shirt. And I can tell you, kind of, it's not just for this thing. She wears that a lot. I mean,
to the think that I'm out on the town, no.
And like, that's such a great example, I think, of, and yes, it is a festival to celebrate creativity, but like here where you both talking about dull in the most undull way, like bringing it to life. So using, like, to your point, Adam, how do we get to a point where we don't do that? And you were getting attention before we even walked in the room. We were just like, ooh, what's this? And so we had our attention through a format that we were holding in our hands. Before we got in the room and sat down, we were drawn in. Like, it was incredible.
That's the reality. I mean, that's Adam. That's all Adam. I am not a creative person by any stretch of the imagination, but I do know that what amplifies attention are things like unexpectedness. And, Adam said it before, it's like emotions and unexpectedness and, triggers, essentially. So he absolutely nailed it in that way. Of course, I was like, okay. But being a quant girl, I just went, you do that. You do you, I'll do me.
When we think, Karen, just about maybe the dull media, like, I do think it is possibly easier for people to wrap their heads around what we mean by dull creative, and it might be subjective that I would have, although the data would probably suggest it's not all that subjective. Like, we probably think a lot of the same stuff is dull. But do people struggle a little bit with understanding what we mean by dull media?
Possibly, but it's really easy to codify. So ultimately, as I said, we used attention volume, which is how many people watch for how long. So if you think about it out of a pot of 100%, where if you buy 1 million impressions, you expect, although most people don't expect it, but let's just say you'd hope that for your money, you get all of the reach that you're buying to watch for the entire course of the ad. That is 100% attention volume, which is attentive audience. So the audience size and time, and that's 100%. But, obviously I've been in market enough to explain that's not the reality. So when you scroll, you might watch for a half a second and exit. So if you think about what's left of that 100%, that's wastage. That's served, not seen. And so it's a pretty easy way to explain how we did this study, because the more attention volume is more people watch for longer. So that's the non-dull. And then you kind of go right down to the bottom end and you've got the extremely dull, which is fewer people watch for less often. So if you think about it in those terms, it's pretty simple to understand. But the outcome of that is one has more attention time with people. So there's more memory, there's more time with the brand, there's, more of an upside in so many ways, and in this true case, it is the case that you get more outcomes. But then on the other side, the flip side is you have fewer people, so you have fewer reach, and you have less time with that ad. What do you think is going to happen? So what we found in the early work is, because I always like to play with the data to understand descriptives before I start to build a model, is that all of the things that a marketer holds dear, in terms of attribution and ROI, and was literally a step change down. So to every layer. So best, next best, least worst, worst in that order. So I knew we were onto something by using this measure, which doesn't surprise me as an attention researcher, because I know that, as I said, that particular metric is the most predictive of outcomes. But yeah, I think that's the easiest way to describe it. So less wastage, more attention, less attention, and everything in between.
And I guess because some of the questions then, because you've got this duality here, right? So you could have an amazing piece of not dull creative or undull, I can't, what's grammatically correct there, creative, but you're showing it, pushing it out in really dull media formats, right? And so you might have spent all this time and money and effort on making something that's wonderful, engaging, and has the opportunity to gain attention. But then because you're maybe buying against metrics, or
so
whatever those
basically you're saying, if you put non-dull creative on extremely dull media, what happens? The short answer is you still will deviate above the average, but the average will be small. So if you have an amazing piece of creative on an attention platform, let's call it, I'm not going to call it out, but
TV,
something like TV or CTV or streaming Netflix, etc. What will happen is the median, there's a large upside for good creative, because overall around 10 seconds of time is kind of what you're given. So you've got, if you're really average, you'll get less. And if you're really amazing, you'll get right up to that boundary. But you put that same piece of creative on a long programmatic web kind of, I call it the long tail of shit, then what will happen is your average in your medium is smaller. So that range is smaller. So you might be lucky if the entire boundary is 1.5 seconds. So the average gets 0.75. So if you've got an amazing piece of Cannes Lion award winning, you might get 1.5 seconds. But it's in line with the performance of the format. So good creative it suffers on extremely dull media because it doesn't have the stage to let the star perform. That's essentially how it works.
And you say you're not creative, and you come up with things like
I've been hanging out with this now.
And then Adam, maybe the opposite side of that, with dull creative on the higher attention formats. Like, what have you seen there in terms of that? Like, is there something where just because we are getting people to see it, they are spending longer with it, that has an opportunity to help a brand? And maybe it's dull, but it might have some distinctive assets that you're rolling out.
So would you rather me answer that one, Adam?
Well,
yeah, I'm handing that to Karen.
Yeah. So the truth is exactly that. So I would rather have a dull piece of creative on a non-dull media for exactly those reasons, because you can't always have hero content, right? Sometimes it's normal, but at least the brand gets seen. At least you'll be attributed to whatever you're selling, at least.
Yeah.
But if you put an amazing Cannes Lion award-winning piece of creative on extremely dull media, you get nothing. So I would rather the opposite is true, but the perfect nirvana is both non-dull.
And I think this is where it fits back with Peter's original analysis.
Yeah.
So it is possible to be successful with dull stuff, because obviously the IPA is looking at successful case histories, but you have to spend a lot of money on it. So you have to really spend a lot of money on TV, for instance.
Hence the point of this content, this thing. Yeah.
Yeah.
So you have that, but you're going to just have to spend so much more on it for it to land with that.
Yeah. And interestingly, so first of all, and there might be all sorts of reasons corporately why you choose to do that, right? There might be reasons why you don't want to take any risks, or it seems appropriate to, for whatever contextual reason, to do that. But I mean, the other thing that Peter's been doing a lot of work on in terms of content recently is looking at things like trust and I'm not going to share the specifics of the data because it's his to share. But I mean, essentially why trust, for instance, is, if you are a brand that is trying to succeed through building trust, that is even more expensive if you choose to be dull and trying to build. So if you're trying to, again, give factual reasons, 55% of people choose this, that's a very expensive way to build trust, for instance, by being dull around that. So I think we're just really at the beginning of digging into this and starting to really find it out.
Amazing.
That is really, really interesting. And I work in a category where I work in insurance. When you wake up as a child saying, I hope I work in insurance someday.
Oh,
That's
I'm so jealous.
Interestingly, of course, if you're in the States, because what Geico have done in terms of, completely changing the game in that category, it's a really aspirational category to work in.
And that's the opportunity, is like, it's dull, but there is brands that do really interesting creative work, but trust is a big thing. So I can't wait for that stuff to come out on trust, because it's a hard metric to move.
Yeah.
But the other thing I wanted to just kind of come back to is, we talk a little bit about, extremely dull and non-dull. What you should understand in my study that is different to the original one is mine is a campaigns. So whereas theirs was ads, which single unit. So mine was campaigns with multiple units. And so what the difference is that so the volume describes the bulk of the ad buy, the media buy. So that means there's a mixture of both in all of the levels. But what's interesting is there's this really clear pattern, and I call it the 80-20 of attention, is that the non-dull campaigns have more bad end and less long tail, whereas the opposite is true of the extremely dull. So to be honest, I'm not kind of sitting here going, let's be unrealistic and always buy the most expensive, the best, but it's the mix that's right. So interestingly, I see a 60-40 split. I'm not trying to mimic our friends, but that's kind of the perfect sweet spot where it's probably more affordable, but you're not losing quite as much.
So that's so interesting, the distinction as well, or just the mix, because I think when people read or hear some of these things, they might be like, okay, so everything I do has to be, 5.9 stars, has to be on a hero channel, but it's actually saying, no, you've got to get your mix right, which is really encouraging, I think.
Yeah, absolutely.
But you need great partners in that, I think, both on the agency side, creatively, you need the media agencies bought into it. Are you, both of you from those sides, are you seeing people kind of buying into it and seeing that, yes, we need the heroes, but we also need that kind of the other stuff?
I think, in terms of getting a lot of interest in it and a lot of attention around it, I think certainly a lot of interest and attention from the agency side in particular. And there are a lot of people saying, this is fantastic, I'm using this, conversation with our clients. Just starting to get sort of very senior multinational clients saying, tell us a lot more about this, because it sounds very relevant to us. And I'm sure they will need, more convincing and want to dig into the data, and would really love to start to plug into their own data sets. So one of the things we're always looking for is data owners. And there are clearly some very big multinational companies out there sitting on some very big data sets, which would be wonderful to do some of this analysis with if we could. So always looking to replicate that and take it into their own market.
And do you find, you mentioned this being replicated in other markets, do you find differences? And Karen, we've talked about this before with your work, but, are there differences that you're seeing in other markets? Because again, you think about some of those multinationals who might say we see different behaviors in Brazil to Bangladesh or whatever. Have you seen any differences?
So I think this is where our work differs, right? Because creative is human, and it's cultural, and it's about the experience in that country. I'm sure there's some that are systematically similar, but generally speaking, a brand would have it so that it's relative. Different with media. Media is very systematically same. So the user experience of Facebook here is very the same as it is there, is the same as it is in the US, etc. To be honest, the spread of the creative will change because of those reasons. So a customer, if they wanted us to redo Cost of Dull, their creative might see a different point at which they sit against the average. But in terms of the norms of best, worst, non-dull, extremely dull, it'll be the same outcomes without any shadow of doubt. And that's why I love my job, because it is so predictable that we can help people fix that. It's not subjective anyway.
If you would like to reach an engaged community of marketing leaders, get in touch with That's What I Call Marketing to discuss sponsorship opportunities.
And Adam, from your perspective, then, have you experienced that? Like, again, you talked to the people in France about dull creative. What are the big differences? I think Karen touched on the cultural piece. Are there any other kind of things that you've seen?
So I think the answer is ask me again in a year's time, because all that data is just about to come out, really. And the really interesting opportunity, I think, is to look at Asia, for instance, and we're trying to find a way to do it in Asia. At the moment, we've just got US, UK, and they're very similar. I mean, that's just one of the big distinctions we should be talking about, is that the System 1 data confirms that B2B is indeed duller than B2C. As you know, you don't need me to tell you that, but the data kind of confirms that. We are seeing significant differences in certain areas, but in terms of geographically and culturally, we still got to work that out. But I think we will have that data within the next year.
Can I ask a question? I'm going to take the microphone away. So Adam, question on that. I haven't seen that research. So you said that they're finding that B2B marketing is duller than B2C, but it is in the context of a target group, because clearly there's relevance at a play. So my question is, the return on investment ratio different? I'm just interested in, does it matter that it's duller? Because the impact within a relevant group might be greater. So we should ask our friend that.
We should. I mean, I think if Peter was in the room, what he'd say is a lot of it is to do with a kind of performance mindset. The sense that actually in B2B, there's a kind of greater assumption that people are already interested in your category.
Got it.
And therefore you don't need to really engage them so much, because you're just trying to get them across the line with your brand rather than somebody else's brand. And that's a misapprehension, because actually the rules are as true as everybody else. So I think it's a mixture of the two, probably.
That is interesting. That's going to be fascinating, because B2B is just known, or I think the perception I've called out, like a mind-numbingly boring. People say it's like putting a PowerPoint in the Financial Times as your ad,
Right,
all this stuff we want to say at you. And, for some reason we think people aren't human when they're a CFO or a CTO. Do you know what I mean? It's like, no, they're humans.
This is why I think I talked to Seth Matlins, who heads up the Ford CMO program, and he was talking about the insurance stuff in the States. And his point was that what Geico set off was an arms race, effectively, of creativity in American insurance business. And I suppose I'm sort of waiting and hoping that actually that's what might happen in B2B as well, which you just need to get one or two players in big categories to do really interesting stuff. And then the rest of the market goes, we need some of that. I think we should need to look at reasons to be cheerful alongside all the kind of doom and gloom and self-flagellation.
It's interesting.
I think that is a reason to be cheerful.
Absolutely. And you talk about the Geico ad, and I remember, I think I may have still been an academic even, that the Geico Unskippable won the gold at one point. And I remember years later looking at it and going, that is genius, not just because it's creative, but because the brand was up front. So it's one of those ads that will survive any platform that it's on, because it basically goes, here's what we're selling and here's the storyline if you want to leave, So I love that example. And I think they've probably continued that sort of flow, but that was my moment. I think that's a genius ad.
It's so good. Peter Field talked us through that as well, myself and Paul Durbin and a few others, and so it's amazing. And that's a long time ago that we talked to him about it, and it sticks in your brain now. Like, God, that's good advertising, isn't it? And there, it doesn't matter the format, the platform, it was a good piece of creative. But that maybe gets a little bit to the point of how that happens, that we land at dull. Because as you said at the start, Adam, nobody wakes up in the morning going, I'm going to make something really dull and I'm going to put it in the dullest place I can find. I guess from what you're seeing and the even conversations you're having, how is it happening, and what are the things maybe we can do to overcome it?
So I think when we first started talking about dull content, about why it's happening, and I think Karen can talk about, the kind of illusion of efficiency a bit later on. But we, again, to be stimulating as well as useful, I hope, we talked about the dull eclipse. So there's lots of people who are talking about this. You might have come across Thomas Heatherwick, the designer, talking about the blandemic of modern architecture. And so we talked about the dull eclipse. Why, what are the four horsemen of the dull eclipse? And so we speculated there were four key macro factors going in. So the performance mindset, and how, because performance is seen to be, one of the key drivers for any business, understandably, at some level in certain areas. Nevertheless, it leads to a mindset that says we don't really need to try that hard to get people interested in our category because they're already interested in our category. We just need to get them across the line. And of course, that's not true. We know that's not true. We know that 95% of people aren't in the category most of the time in most categories. We have to work much harder to engage them and get them in, but we're not doing that. So that was the first thing. The second thing I think was interesting was the notion of optimization. And there's, again, other people have written about this. We're trying to aggregate what people have already talked about, written about anything else. So I think a really good example of this is kind of logo changes and how, we know as good brand owners that a logo now has to work in environments as small as a thumbnail to up to 48 sheet posters. So actually we tend to do rather blocky, change our logos to rather blocky, easily readable solutions, which in and of themselves in a media context make a lot of sense, but strip any differentiation out compared to the competition. It's a really good example of smart, well-intentioned people doing what appears to be a very good decision in itself, but we're not looking at the context enough. We're just not looking at the context enough. So it weakens differentiation while, averaging. I'm sure you've read Alex Murrell and his Age of Average. That's very good study. And Orlando's talked a lot about this as well, hasn't he? About actually how we're using kind of benchmarks, and particularly social benchmarks, which lead to this kind of homogenization of everything in culture as well. All Airbnbs look the same, all hipster cafes look the same. It's the Australian coastal aesthetic, I think, technically it's called. And then finally, I think, I haver between the two things here, but I mean, procurement and the emphasis on cost efficiency, I think has a lot to answer for, particularly in terms of what agencies are remunerated for. If you really shave down how much an agency is making to kind of borderline amounts of money, and the real cost to an agency is going round and round in terms of creative work. And you could argue perhaps clients have become kind of juniorized in the sense that briefs are being pushed down. So you get lower quality briefs being pushed to agencies where the creative work is being generated to find out really what the brief was in the first place. It becomes unprofitable very quickly for an agency to try and produce good work. So very quickly you get to the stage where the creative director very often is a very senior member of the agency responsible for the profitability of it. You think, well, just give the client what they want,
Which happens, right?
Right. All the time. And it's not what anybody wants. And at some level, procurement is a really good example of smart, well-intentioned people doing apparently the right thing. Of course, you want to manage your costs as a business. And of course, you need to consider your agency costs not in the same way, but as you would consider other costs. It's just that we're considering them the wrong way. And we're not understanding the effects of doing that with the sort of the punitive levels of, I think, sort of screwing down the profitability of agencies that we are. Again, I sit next to clients, so it's slightly different. I'm going on a little rant here. I sit next to clients. I sat next to a brilliant client the other day who said, we're just not getting the quality of planning that we used to.
Right.
We're just not getting the quality of strategies. We're not getting the time, we're not getting the level. And I said, it's because you're not paying agencies what they need to do that. But we're in this sort of vicious circle, and it's not going to go up again. It's not like, okay, fine, we'll pay our agents 50% more. We have to find a way through it.
From a media side, that is because of this little thing called cost per meaningless thousand.
Yes.
It's pretty hard. I mean, you're sort of saying planning's not doing their job, or planning's not, whatever the procurement people are saying. But ultimately, it's interesting we still use a metric that is so easily influenced by bidding and best line of whatever, So CPM used to be representative of actual reach, which is the value exchange and the cost. But we have a circular way, like the cost is biddable. So the line is set from what you think is value, but that value is wrong because the reach component has this problem around seen versus served, right? So no one knows what's happening behind the delivery relative to how many people are seeing it and for how long. So we pay a value that's arbitrary. So cost per meaningless thousand is a thing. And so subsequently, what's happening is, procurement are going, all right, we'll just have to optimize towards the lowest cost per meaningless thousand. Theoretically, we can probably get more impressions, which compounds the problem. And then you have this whole inefficiency cycle. It's illusion of efficiency. So I wrote a paper years ago. Actually, it ended up getting in the Wall Street Journal, which kind of showed that, often CPM, because someone will say, oh, the absolute cost of format A is so much lower than the absolute cost of, a non-dull format. So we should just go here. But the reality is what I've seen, and I wrote about it, was that often this is too cheap and this is too expensive relative to the gap that sits in the middle. And essentially that's what this model is about. It's about understanding the true cost of not investing up here. And the wastage is significant. It's around 43 cents in the dollar.
Yeah. Karen, you've talked before as well about the paying more can sometimes be better. So chasing the cheapest just doesn't work, right?
Because the value is worse. So if you think about it in that way, so instead of getting cost per 1,000, you might be getting cost per 10.
Yeah.
That's the problem. So it's the reality of the value of it is hidden by bad media metric.
And then also, and I won't rant too much, but the black box of what you do, so there's platforms like PMax is a great example where you've no idea what's going on. Like you just have no clue. And sorry, I'm saying that, neither of you are saying that, but like it is, you put something in and it goes all these places and you don't really know. And so you're focused solely on the dollar amount, right?
Yeah, look, it's pretty sad. But I actually think, not trying to be bleak, although I am wearing my Ennui t-shirt. Not that's bleak, but it's about burning money, mate. So don't worry, your creators.
It's in a fun way.
It's of AI is going to be worse because you think it's now. Whoa.
Yeah.
And we'll have all these bad agents that come in and, I will be surfing.
So just conversely on the AI thing, so I'm sort of changing my view about this, which is in a world where only 50% of ads beat the cow, AI can do better than that. AI can absolutely do better than that.
Yeah, but I think the delivery...
From content creation, not from media content creation.
Yeah, I think from the lack of transparency around the media buy funnel is going to get worse. And it's not even like they're it's more about what we're told is happening. So anyway, which you said.
No.
So I think it's going to get.
It's interesting, isn't it? Like it's going to get worse in some areas, and you say, Adam, maybe other areas it's going to be, maybe. And challenger brands is interesting, right? Because this is a lot of your background as well, Adam. But maybe there's a huge opportunity for challenger brands to, I don't know if it's using AI, but kind of break the disrupt or the dull.
Yeah, I mean, I had a really interesting conversation with somebody in the States who's the CSO of a tax advisory service called Lettuce. And so Lettuce, basically, Conor decides to set up, Conor Irish spring water business as a solopreneur. Congratulations, Conor. They can be enormously successful. And Lettuce advises you on how to manage your taxes. And so it falls under the I know, but this is what's interesting about it. This is what's really interesting about it. So it falls under the important but boring category. So she said she's brilliant. This is Gabrielle. She used to be a planner at the Venables Bell, and she's now a very smart person. She's now the CSO here. And she said, look, we were doing some bottom lower funnel stuff that was kind of explainer that was kind of going okay. She said, but I wanted to do something much more emotional. I'd been doing a podcast called Let's Make This More Interesting. She listened to the first couple of episodes and she said, I want to do something more interesting in taxes for her. So what she did was very smart, which is she said, I had this idea that I wanted to do a musical about taxes. So I get two real creatives from 72 and Sunny, obviously brilliant agency. They come up with 8 scripts and I go to my fintech CEO and I say, I want to make these using AI and test them on Meta. And so he goes, how expensive is that? And she goes, it's this per ad. And she said, I want to do 2 of them. He said, let's do all 8. So they do all 8. And the one that's a musical outperforms all of the others by a factor of 10.
Wow.
So suddenly, you can imagine, right?
Yeah.
Fintech CEO with investor pressure. If you'd pitched them before all of this 5 years ago, we want to do an ad about a musical ad about taxes, they'd have said, well, I'm sure, I don't know if you're now swearing on your program.
Yeah.
But anyway, it would have been quite dismissive. But suddenly, because AI removes the barrier of production, you can go straight to testing brilliant ideas and you can prove that they work. So again, if it's reasons to be cheerful, I would say that actually AI used in the right way here is going to remove that barrier, is going to enable great ideas to be demonstrably more effective than others, and should allow a flourishing of creativity if we can do it in the right way.
So I've seen that too. I mean, there's creative generation businesses popping up everywhere, which, we're a big kind of part of partnerships, but it's more the media side, I was thinking, because the agents are going to be, you think ultimately the agent's going to be tricked in some cases to thinking it's effective and efficient. There's a lot of work to be done, but I think the illusion of efficiency is going to be around for a while, whether it's a procurement person or whether it's an AI.
Yeah.
By the way, one of the things that Karen's work really highlighted for me, and I bear in mind I'm an ex-ad man. I started advertising in the 80s, as I was saying, so I've been around a long time, which I hadn't really quite connected with, is that what you're measuring is what might have happened. People might have seen this. Not what they did see it, but they might have seen it. And I can't imagine any other profession in the world or a category in the world you measure what might have happened.
Oh, you mean when it's served?
Yeah, so my example is football, right? You don't measure, Manchester United might have scored 5 goals, so we'll give them the match. I mean, it's just inconceivably, mind-blowing to me.
Yeah, like finance, we might have hit our targets.
Exactly. We
don't
might have knocked it out of the park.
Yeah, so let's all celebrate. Well done.
Yeah.
But I guess there are things that, like, it shouldn't be this way, but there are things that should help you, like brand tracking is a good thing to kind of, at least, not going to tell you people have seen it, but again, it's historical. Like, I might have been exposed to it. I might use, like, it's just, there's lots of mights, which is it. Look, I've talked about it a lot on the podcast, is they're the challenges we as marketers often face with senior stakeholders, is how we actually tell the story of what is happening and what we can do to get better. But there's so much in this. I know we're getting close to time, and Adam, you'd sent something over last night. We've kind of touched on it a little bit in the how, but you sent this wonderful piece on risk and responsibility. I'd love if you could talk us through that, because it was brilliant. I was saying to you, I was laughing my head off in my car watching it because it really hit home.
Yeah. I mean, clearly one of the things that we're all trying to do as part of this group, and I should say, so it's Karen and John in System 1 and Peter in the IPA data. So there's a group of us traveling together to try and give, it's our gift to the industry. And I suppose one of the things that I'm trying to bring, obviously, is I and my company, Eat Big Fish, have worked with and walked with challenges for the last 25 years. So we're trying to make it usable and useful, and trying to offer tools that can help people kind of address this. And one of the things, and at the moment, the way we're thinking of the project is the first part was Costadol content, then Costadol media, and now we're trying to look at Costadol product as a third part. And then coming out of all of that, want to see whether we're pulling all those threads together into a piece about, how we should be thinking about it. How can we address this kind of delta between good intention and reality? Yeah. And I was very struck by coming across again. I've loved it for a while. It's a piece of film called Risk and Responsibility. And perhaps I can give you the link and you can share it.
Definitely.
Promote it. It was produced by the Creative Circle, which was a kind of creative kind of awards group in the UK that doesn't exist anymore, I don't think, in the 70s. And it's a piece of black and white film, and it's very of its time. So there's lots of people in black turtlenecks smoking on screen and all this kind of stuff. But the idea is a really interesting idea, which is it's trying to have a discussion about what is really risk and what is really responsibility in terms of producing great advertising. And they have this fantastic bit where they role play the first presentation of a very famous campaign that Ogilvy produced. I think David Ogilvy wrote it, didn't he? Called The Man in the Hathaway Shirt, which is, if your listener is not, or viewer is not familiar, it's a sort of a distinguished looking man of kind of, relatively advanced years with a black eye patch and a shirt just looking up there. And it just says The Man in the Hathaway Shirt. That was the idea. And they role play the creative director presenting that idea to the clients. And what happens is a sequence where the clients say what in many ways are responsible things to say, and the agency responds in a responsible way by listening potentially and that kind of stuff. And together they produce absolute shit. The client will say, I absolutely love it. I love it. Very striking, this man in the shirt and the eye patch and all the rest of it. But just one thing, obviously we do the shirt in other kinds of designs as well. Shouldn't we show some of the other designs? And they give a very good point. So they do a version of it where there's lots more patterns of the shirts down one side. And then they say, yes, okay, but I really like this, getting much better. But, the Man in the Hathaway Shirt, where's the customer benefit?
Yes.
What's the so what? Can we change the line? So they change the line, they come back responsibly. And then eventually, of course, you get to the stage where they say, yes, I like him very much, but the eye patch, I mean, what's behind it? Some people might be upset by that, so they take the eye patch off. So again, each of those is apparently a very sensible thing to say and a responsible thing to say based on what one might know as a producer of advertising, and each of them makes it significantly worse. So I think there's a really interesting opportunity to talk about risk and responsibility in terms of kind of the cost of reducing stuff, because to the point we were making, and indeed to Karen's point about we're all smart, well-intentioned people, a lot of decisions are being made for apparently the right reasons, but they're leading to really poor outcomes. So how can we have that conversation about what is risk and responsibility? And as part of that, we're sort of talking to, so Karen Crum and her team at EY have done some really interesting work about creating right language around this, language that is convincing to the CFO, convincing to the PE partner. And I think getting it in the right language then as well is going to be an important part of that final stage.
Because I was living in what are the words or the questions we can ask ourselves to, because you're in those moments, like we all know, like you're in those moments, crazy busy, somebody looks at something and you, oh, not sure about that. And you overthink things sometimes. And you pull yourself away from what really was the essence of the brilliance of the work. Like it is shared language, or just not even shared language, but like the words, the right words to use, the right questions to ask, I think become really important.
And then, obviously translate it into media, which is, it seems apparently the right thing to balance effectiveness and efficiency. But as Karen was saying, a lot of those efficiency conversations are actually irresponsible if you really know what's going on and you really look at it. And I think part of this is about just getting people to look much harder at what's really happening. Certainly in the media case, I'm shocked that so few people are talking about it. I mean, for all that Karen's been beating the drum, and for all that you are getting some attention.
So the MRC standards dropped last week. There's definitely a call. I just think it's not a sexy topic, media buying. I think creative is the sexy one. So I think
wasted money should be a very sexy topic.
Oh, look,
surely.
It's interesting even hearing you talk about risk and responsibility. I mean, I haven't seen that clip, but, I think that's an interesting one, because I think there's so many people that get it, but the risk of change it's becoming more and more. So pretty much most brands I know have an attention strategy of some sort, and the industry is evolving. And I think there's another round of evolution to come. Yeah.
Okay.
T-shirt.
Listen, thank you both so much for this. It's just wonderful talking to you, seeing you both again, and just like what a great conversation we've had. But this work is, Karen, we've talked before about the importance of your work, but this work is so important, and I think where it's going to go as well sounds really interesting, and that can't wait to see the next stage. And as Karen always promised me, the world exclusives on her work.
I always promise you that. Oh, yeah.
So much, really, really appreciate it. I'll have links to all the work, the things we've referenced here today in the show notes. If people haven't read it, please go and read it. There's lots of things for marketers to get their head around, and I think this stuff becomes just really practical and useful. So thank you both so much.
Thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you.
Well, I hope you enjoyed that episode, and if you did and could share it with one other person, rate or review, it really does help us grow an amazing community of marketers just like you. Really grateful to Adam and Karen for joining me today on the episode. It really was wonderful to spend time with them. I said at the start, it was something that we wanted to do in today's episode, was really go into places that they haven't discussed before, but founding it, I think, in the principles of what we mean by dull media, dull creative, and where everything is going next. It's going to be really interesting to see where things land in the next 12 months and where they go with this work and this research, and just how meaningful it is for us as brands. And what I loved in this episode was how we were able to get to the realities as well of being a marketer, and how not everything can be hero, not everything can be big, beautiful, well-produced ads that are shown only on TV, for 60 seconds. That's not the reality of the world we live in, but it's understanding the mix and how we make sure we are getting the most out of the money we are spending on behalf of the companies we work for. Listen, thanks again for tuning in. I hope you enjoy the episode, and from me, your host, Conor Byrne, take care.